debate, which offers, I think, a new perspective on all of what we have been hearing during these past hours and the previous days about globalizing and, let's say, meridionalizing the agenda or complexifying the agenda, not only in the Black Sea and the Balkans security perspective. Global South, we'll be talking today with four eminent speakers, and I'm very happy to host them, and I will present them once I give them the floor, about Global South, the war in Ukraine, perspectives and attitudes, similarities and differences. Well, I want to start off, kicking off by saying there's a lot of ways of mentioning what we so-call the Global South when it comes to geopolitics or South to South. Some say it's a return of a non-alignment policy. If you play with the words, the spirit of Bandung in 1956, where emerging countries are asking for more relevant decision process or being part of the international governance perspective. Some would argue that the merge of this Global South is a synonym of de-Occidentalization or Orientalization, or the end of the multilateral system that we have known since 79 years when was created the United Nations, 75 years when was created NATO, or the 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some would argue, like Prime Minister of India Modi, that we are already in what he calls a new multi-non-alignment momentum, and this has to be taken in consideration with newly created international intergovernmental organization. I spoke about the United Nations with its 79 years of existence, but let's have in consideration that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was only created in 2001, that the BRIC and its first format was only created in 2005, and the BRICS Plus, which may be growing in capacity by the Kazan summit in October, will, of course, play a huge and bigger role, such as well as the G77, who gathered in La Havana a few months ago. So, to address the question, if I may say so, gentlemen and my colleague in my left, I wanted to address maybe four real or clear questions. Is there really a Global South? Because if you take in consideration the role that the Global South has had in regards to the Ukraine or the war integration of Ukraine, there's clearly a huge difference in the relation that each one of these countries have in regards in the war of Ukraine. Let's just take the G20 countries. A majority of the G20 countries voted the United Nations resolution 2 weeks after the war in aggression, at the exception of India, China, and Turkey. We have a Turkish colleague. He will maybe explain and give us some thoughts about that. My second question, is there a gap between a rule-based world order and what is the so-called sovereign illiberal democracy way of thinking the international relations? Let's take in consideration what the maze of the Kremlin, Vladimir Surkov, advocates for, saying that the universality of values is something which was created by the Western part of the world after the Second World War. Therefore, we are, I think, and this is a question I can raise, in a momentum where some want to relativize the universality of the values that we cherish in the liberal, democratic, rule-based order that has been the, building the balance of power to this day. Third question, I will only have four. If we take that in consideration, there's no doubt that Russia is in favor of this Global South anti-Occidental narrative, such as it is fueled by Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria. I put in comma Algeria, but I could add Cuba, Eritrea, and Belarus. And follow-up question, what is the impact of this momentum in the war in Ukraine? Is there therefore a real dissensions between the North and the South when it comes to, for example, the reconstruction of Ukraine coming from a Latin America perspective. I do know that Charles Powell will address that. Turkey and the oriental part of Europe. I know my colleague from XIVb and my colleague from CETA will address that question, and I know, because I've spoken with them just a few minutes ago, with Africa, very important elements on that. My fourth question, I think, is an important question linked to the subject of these 2 days. How can we take the advantage of a certain form of this strategic momentum to the benefit of Ukraine, or for the reconstruction of Ukraine? And maybe I will finish with some figures. If you take in consideration the GDP of the G7 countries, we are more or less in a 50 trillion of dollars of GDP, with huge differences between the countries. For example, the GDP of USA being 9 times bigger than the GDP of France. But on the other hand, when it comes to BRICS, or when it comes to SCO, we are more or less having a more robust GDP, even though it has to be relativized because the GDP per capita is by far stronger in the G7 than in the BRICS. So how can we get that money to be helpful for the reconstruction of Ukraine, as it is not only the 27 EU countries, the 32 NATO countries, but 50 nations who are dedicated for the reconstruction, both on humanitarian, political, and military capacity of Ukraine. This being said, I'm very honored to have in my left Christopher Alden, director of London School of Economics, a policy think tank called Ideals. Well, I was Latinizing the word in London. I'm very happy to find my old friend and colleague, director of Elcano Royal Institute from Spain, Charles Power. I'm very happy to meet Natalia Tilidou. I do not know Natalia Tilidou, but I've been having some links for some decades now with XIVb, the Hellenic Foundation for Foreign Policy, geopolitical and foreign policy. And I think we were in the same panel last year. Marat Aslan, researcher from Foundation for Political, Economical and Social Research, CETA from Turkey, or Turkey as we see it now. So, gentlemen and my colleague from my left, I will maybe start by you, if you want, of course, to give you 8 minutes about the subject, and if you want to address some of the questions that I raised, I would be very happy about that. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for New Strategy Center for the invitation. So in my today's speech, I would like to actually address the security assistance activities in the Global South, Russia's security assistance activities in the Global South, and especially in Africa, and particularly through the Wagner Group. And I think I will address actually your question about how Russia's position actually changes the balance in the region. So first I will explain how the Wagner Group has provided military support and training in countries like Mali and Central African Republic, allowing Russia to maintain plausible deniability. Second, I will discuss the continuation of these operations following the death of the Wagner's group leader. And finally, I will highlight what Russia gains from these activities. So, before the war in Ukraine, Russia was already providing security assistance to the Global South through the Wagner Group. This private military company allowed Russia to maintain plausible deniability while exerting influence in different countries where there was already a conflict. And what I mean with plausible deniability is this idea that Russia was able to influence specific outcomes and interests that they had in the conflicts without being directly to blame, to have to avoid direct blame from the international community if there were any controversial or illegal activities that the Wagner Group actually had. So Wagner's activities range from training local armies, establishing air force capabilities, and running propaganda campaigns, something we have discussed also in previous panels. So take Mali, for example. Wagner has been active since December 2021. At the peak of that engagement, Wagner had over 2,000 personnel in Mali, including teams handling a small air force and providing security for the ruling elite. Now we know that in Mali, already the West was present with the UN mission MINUSMA and of course with the French army. But the Malian government went against this, as they call it, soft or population-centric approach to counterinsurgency. And the Wagner Group actually provides the support, a military approach to dealing with the insurgency in the north, coming from the jihadist groups. It also allowed for Wagner to continue to be part of the conflict when the French and the MINUSMA actually left, because there was a growing discontent towards the French-sponsored reconciliation road for pacifying Tuareg rebels in the north. So without Wagner, the Malian army forces will lack the strength to confront this insurgency. And Wagner's influence in Mali isn't just military, it was also political and social. They have exploited local dissatisfaction with the security situation and the anti-French sentiments to justify their presence. A similar pattern is evident in the Central African Republic. Since January 2018, Wagner and another Russian private military company, the name is Patriot, provided military training and security in exchange for access to valuable resources like gold, uranium, and diamonds. Wagner has been crucial in securing the regime of President Touadéra against rebel groups, and I will give you an example that in 2020, where the rebel groups were actually approaching the capital, Wagner Group was crucial to defending the government and the President Touadéra. However, the involvement has also led to increased violence and human rights abuses and further militarizing the region. For example, Wagner has instructed local militias to merge with the state army and function as self-defense units in designated areas. Nevertheless, these groups began behaving aggressively and independently of the government, committing human rights abuses against civilians. So the presence of Wagner not only increased the number of violent functions, but also escalated the militarization of the region. Now you will ask me what happened after the death of Prigozhin. I will tell you that the operations continue. There were some changes. Of course, in the beginning, there were some delays in the salaries, some unsettlement feelings of the staff, and of course some suspended operations, but the Wagner continued to act in the same countries with using the same gear and aiming for the same goals. For example, in Mali, after some disagreements, Wagner agreed to work directly with the Russian Ministry of Defense. This meant the ministry didn't charge Wagner for vehicles, planes, or bullets used in places like Mali. The ministry still let Wagner help, especially in fighting, but they're also looking for other ways to help, like with another private military company, Reboot. And we know that these operations actually continue and to an extent deepen by the fact that shortly after Prigozhin's mutiny, there was a Kremlin meeting decided that the Wagner in Africa operations will fall under the Russian military intelligence. And in early September, General Averyov and Defense Minister Yevrukov toured different operations of Wagner in Africa. So what it changed was that the plausible deniability now for Russia was not present, as it was much more engaged as an actor. However, it allowed for Russia to ask for specific outcomes much more provocatively. So what does Russia gain from this? And I will conclude. So Russia involvement in Africa through the Wagner Group yields several strategic benefits. First, it bolsters Russia's security standing. A prime example is the agreement to establish a Russian naval base at Port Sudan, basically giving Russia coveted access to the Red Sea. It's still undergoing some decision to be made to if it's going to happen or not. Of course, there is a US pressure for that to not to happen, but it is present. Secondly, Russia gains access to strategically important natural resources. In the past 2 years, Russia has extracted $2.5 billion worth of gold from Africa, most likely funding its war in Ukraine, according to the Blood Gold report. And lastly, Russia offers another engagement, pragmatic engagement, as an alternative to diminishing Western development aid. So my conclusion is that Russia's strategy in Africa through the Wagner Group and other means is a clear attempt to assert its influence and weaken the global standing of the United States and its allies. By providing security assistance, gaining access to valuable resources, and offering an alternative to diminishing Western aid, Russia becomes a power broker. So as we move forward, it's crucial to understand these dynamics and consider the implication for global security in international relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You tackled an important subject about Africa, and I will, of course, give the floor just after to Chris about that, about the fact that in the horizontalization of warfare, with the territorialization of Africa, Russia is trying to challenge the contenders of Russia. You mentioned it very clearly with France in Sahel, because we have been experiencing both a political defeat, because we were kicked out of the 3 countries that you mentioned, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, but because we are under threat on a constant basis with cyber propaganda, with the informational warfare that a certain number of companies, private companies, SMPs, that you mentioned, are very well playing this strategy. But it does not only concern France. It also concerns Great Britain. When it comes to Sudan, this is why I'm going to give the floor to Chris Alden. It also concerns Spain and Latin European countries such as Italy and Spain. This is why I think it is very important to have in mind, when we have to read it very thoroughly, the common Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin declaration after the visit of Vladimir Putin in Beijing, which is as important as the 2007 Virkunde declaration of Putin in 2007, because they're saying exactly where they want to go. They want to challenge the leadership inside the international organization to bring it to their position and not, of course, having this bargain of governance. So I will turn to you, Chris, about some additional vision of Africa, and then I will ask Charles and after Marat.
Thanks. I'm going to make some general points. Okay, well, I have this one. I'm going to make some general points and then move to the example of South Africa in particular on this. Definitional points. What's the Global South? Well, the Global South is bound by a certain set of shared experiences, one of them the post-colonial experience. They draw from that. You've mentioned Bandung. Second, they have a shared development agenda. They have a commitment as countries to improve their development status. Some of them are emerging powers, some have gone very far, but it's been something that they've all shared, and it's reflected in their activities in the United Nations and elsewhere. And they have a shared concern around sovereignty. They look at the question of sovereignty in classic Westphalian perspective, and they are almost universally default to that position. They have a common UN platform. That's the point of the Global South is that diversity you spoke of is manifest, especially in the regional settings. But when you get to a UN platform, that's where the meaning of the Global South as an organizing principle plays out around those kinds of key questions I've just mentioned in sovereignty, development, and the post-colonial past, or the colonial past. They pursued a policy of non-alignment. The Cold War version of that was sitting between two blocks. The contemporary version of that, articulated out of Chile by Jorge Hein and others, is what they call active non-alignment. What they do is they look at, they've moved from the relatively benign environment of unipolarity and said we're now being forced into a set of choices between a world that sees high levels of global competition, between two, if not blocks, we're not there yet, but certainly two very distinct perspectives. And that active non-alignment is transactional, and it feels that alliance behavior is to be discouraged amongst global South countries. So everything is interest-based and about seeking strategic autonomy as they measure and weigh the different choices or pressures they would experience. On the global values side of things, I hadn't written that down in my notes, but I want to speak to that because I agree with you, it's quite important. Since 2023, China has been taking a leading position on this through its global three initiatives: the Global Development Initiative in the United Nations, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilizational Initiative. Each of these initiatives represent different pillars of UN activity, and under that is the UN Charter and the values that are rooted in that. This is a world of, as my late colleague would have called it, this is a world of civilizational states as opposed to the states that we're more accustomed to, articulating values in broad civilizational terms. And it matters to the Global South question because the audience at play in a UN setting is the Global South, right? They're the ones who are going to validate, verify, or block, if you like, these particular initiatives. Again, refitting, repurposing Western-dominated perspectives, interpretations of values, and saying they're more relative. There's civilizations here. We're all competing civilizations. We have some overlap, but there are areas where we differ. So this civilizational debate is, it may seem benign, but I think it has a very strong effort to repurpose liberal international institutions into one that's more friendly to the needs and concerns. And the Global South is the audience at play in this. So specific to South Africa, I think it's a great example for different reasons than your examples of Africa, because in one case, it's a liberal democracy. It has been a market-friendly economy, so it's very much part of the unipolar globalization liberal order after the Cold War. It also is, the lead party in government is a liberation movement, one that was during the Cold War period, had quite closely aligned to the Soviet Union. So it has a history which represents the world that we are in the past and its manifestations, contemporary manifestations. It's also a BRIC and a G20. Okay, so it's at play in the leading fora across the international system today. So its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been, I think, worthwhile focusing in on, because it has that multiple positions, identities, and pressures that come with that. One of the things it did initially, in the very first days of the invasion, was to condemn it. Okay, and pile in with those who were condemning it, saying, well, this is violation of sovereignty and all that sort of stuff. The ambassador was soon called in and asked to reverse his position henceforth, right? So the UN. And from there, we can see a changing narrative, which is much more ambivalent. Sometimes it's manifested as abstaining. Sometimes it's supportive, blocking efforts to take Russia out of the UN Human Rights Council or condemn it in that sense. Okay, so all of these manifestations over time represent the tug and pull that these states, this Global South state experiences. It was disclosed 6 months into the conflict that South Africa was involved in some kind of armament, either transferring arms or no one's quite sure. But again, taking at least at the military level, having a much less ambivalent position, a much more pro position. There are other ones when it comes to the recent connections of South African Navy and its Chinese equivalent. They're starting to work more actively together. So you have in this the elements of the kinds of ambivalence. Where are they today? They're actually pursuing, and I would say the last point I would say, South Africa has identified and put its position forward very strongly, as you probably know, with the ICJ and the Gaza-Israel conflict. So again, a global South country that is putting its diplomatic efforts towards that particular aim, something which, whether by design or not, I know many South Africans feel extremely strongly on this position, so I think it's a felt position. At the same time, it has the effect of pointing out and is structured to point out the Western hypocrisies on this question, and that plays very well to the Global South audience. These are things that publics within Global South countries have identified, they recognize that, and they look to their own leadership to give expression to that. So I think that in all of these things, we have the features of the Global South as a kind of audience for international activity and the setting of a world agenda that will change over time as part of this movement from unipolarity to a multipolar system. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you thank you so much, Christopher. Listening to what you just said, I had it in mind, as a lot of us, the narrative that Vladimir Putin used justifying the aggression of Ukraine, saying that he was not in war only in Ukraine, he was in war to defend a sort of lost Western Occident measure, a sort of messianic discourse that is very triggering, very easy to understand when you are in Africa. The return of traditional values, the sustain and the defense of family, the importance of religion, the fact that 54 countries do not have a say in the international agenda. And I think we must not forget, and I'm very happy that you pinpointed what I initially said about this notion of civilization, the defense of civilization, which is really utmost importance. And I will now shift the floor to Charles, because there's another issue there. Of course, Charles is a British, but working for a Spanish think tank. We have maybe a sort of lack of interest when we are in Europe about a Iberico-Latino agenda, which is of utmost importance with the election of Javier Milei in Argentina and with President Lula in Brazil. But also there is a very challenging agenda here, because we're speaking about organization that may be negative to our Western Occidental point of view, but there are new elements on the table. And I will take one which may have a interest for Spain. It's the new Afro-Atlantic initiative launched by the King of Spain last November, liaising the 23 Atlantic African countries and engaging them with the partners from the other side of the Atlantic. So how can you address this from your Madrid point of view?
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. It's a pleasure to see you again and to be here in Bucharest with such esteemed colleagues. I'm going to try and address at least three of the big questions that you've posed. So let me start with the Global South question. And I'm going to build on some of the things that Chris has said, but perhaps also deviate from some of the things that he said. Latin America is a big place. There are 33 states in CELAC, which is the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. I'm in two minds about the usefulness of the Global South label in a Latin American context. Going back to Chris's definition, yes, these are all former European territories, be they Spanish, British, French, Dutch, whatever. But the variety within the region is phenomenal. Just within the Caribbean, Haiti, GDP per capita, 3,000 US dollars. Cayman Islands, 75,000 US dollars, just within the Caribbean, which is a tiny proportion of Latin America. If I go to Chile and say, ladies and gentlemen, what a great pleasure it is to be in the Global South, I would probably have to leave the room in a hurry because they would be deeply offended. They do not consider themselves part of the Global South. GDP per capita, 30,000 US dollars. Essentially a population of European extraction, although there are ethnic minorities, of course, in all of these countries. Moving on to the second question, I think this is really what I want to stress. People in the West are often baffled by the ambiguity, if not outright hostility, of some Latin American states. When we turn to them and say, Ukraine for us is existential. The war in Ukraine is existential. If Ukraine loses, the European Union will cease to be an effective, credible global player, and this will give rise to a new era in international relations. Most Latin American leaders and publics are rather indifferent to that argument. And what I really want to explain to you is why. And I think it has to do with Emmanuel's very interesting question. Most Latin American leaders, and I would argue social groups, believe that the so-called liberal international order did very little for them. They genuinely believe that this is an international order which was designed and imposed on them by outsiders, as you were mentioning, Emmanuel, essentially a US and Western European construct. And of course you could say, but surely the existence of predictable international rules is good for everyone. And they would probably say, yes, we adhere to the UN Charter with enthusiasm. We agree that there are universal values. This is not in dispute in Latin America. It is in dispute, of course, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, where people, I have often had this debate in Tehran, the Ayatollahs will say there is no such thing as universal values. There are Islamic values, and you have to respect our cultural difference. Latin Americans will not say that. They will agree that there are universal values, and they will agree that the UN Charter is a wonderful thing, and that the UN is a wonderful organization, if only it worked well. But then they will say, well, what about the WTO? What about the World Trade Organization? What about all of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, etc.? If that is part of the international liberal structure that we're talking about, they feel that this has let them down. But the main point I really want to make is that Latin Americans see themselves as a victim of the Cold War. The Cold War, during the Cold War, they were simply pawns in a chess game which was played out by the USA and the USSR. And what they basically reject is that they do not want to find themselves in a new Cold War. My friend and colleague Robin Niblett has just published a book called The New Cold War, which I strongly recommend. And Latin Americans basically say, you know, the old Cold War was bad enough. We do not want a new Cold War dominated this time round by the systemic rivalry between China and the US. And as Chris was saying, their reply to this is active non-alignment. So if you say the liberal international order is in danger, they will basically say, so what? It hasn't served us well, let's move on. Another reason why I don't really believe in this Global South label, which, by the way, at my institute we refer to as the plural South or the emerging South. We did a study of how Latin American countries vote in the UN General Assembly, voted between 2003 and 2023. Study by Ernesto Talvi, a former foreign minister of Uruguay. And what he discovered was in votes which had to do with things like human rights, democracy, freedom, and so on, the Latin American democracies, which, by the way, today represent about 80–90% of CELAC, of the Latin American state system, on 80% of those occasions, they voted in the same way as the European Union countries did. Compare this to the votes in Africa, 30%. The votes in Asia, 40%. So there is a distinct difference there, which I think, again, calls into question the usefulness of the Global South label applied uniformly throughout the world. But when we looked at the UN votes on things like trade and development, there was an immediate divergence. They stopped voting, or we no longer voted with them. So I think that's an important discrepancy. So Latin Americans are basically, they see themselves as trying to protect themselves from a global, a multipolar order with weak multilateral institutions, increasingly dominated by the bipolar tension between China and the USA. The war in Ukraine has been very interesting. All Latin American countries have condemned the invasion, but none have applied sanctions on Russia. There's a small pro-Russian contingent, the usual suspects, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And there is a small contingent of very pro-Ukraine countries, Javier Milei, whom you just mentioned. Poor President Zelensky has only been able to visit one Latin American country, one, and that is Argentina, for the inauguration of President Milei. In other countries, the parliaments basically rejected his visit. So you have a small minority of pro-Russian countries, a small minority of pro-Ukrainian countries. I would include Colombia under President Petro and Chile under President Boric, which is interesting because this does not reflect a left-right cleavage. Presidents of both ideologies vote differently. And it has nothing to do with Russian disinformation or the Russian economic footprint. It's true that 35 million Latin Americans follow the Russia Today program in Spanish, but that is not the reason. Let me remind you, in economic terms, the Russian footprint is minuscule. It's about 1% of foreign direct investment in the whole of Latin America. So I think the key thing is this idea, this notion of active non-alignment. Let's look very briefly at the two biggest countries, Mexico and Brazil. In Mexico, we have AMLO, Andrés Manuel Pérez López Obrador. AMLO initially accused Ukraine of having provoked Russia into invading them, which is a nice one, frankly, and then allowed Russian troops to parade in the streets of Mexico City on Independence Day while the war was going on. In Brazil, under President Lula, again, very little sympathy for the Ukrainian cause, and indeed, Brazil, partly because it's part of the BRICS, has often seemed to be closer to the Russian and the Chinese position. So active non-alignment basically means protecting yourself from these global conflicts, trying to avoid taking sides, if possible. But this is not always easy. Under the Spanish presidency of the EU, there was an EU-CELAC summit, an EU Latin America Caribbean summit, for the first time in 8 years, which the Spanish government worked very hard to organize. And the summit almost collapsed when it came to approving a final document with some conclusions, because many Central and Eastern European EU states were outraged by Latin American reluctance to include tough language against Russia over the war in Ukraine. And Latin American governments basically argued, why do we have to include language about Ukraine in an EU Latin American summit? Which is a good point, I think. Finally, let me conclude with something Chris mentioned about double standards and Gaza. When we go to the Ukrainians and say, when we go to Latin Americans and say, Ukraine is existential for us, you don't understand that democracy is at stake here. The democracy versus autocracy argument does not really cut much ice in Latin America, even though most Latin American countries are democracies, because basically they will argue that we in the West have sometimes chosen to work with rather unsavory dictatorships all over the world, the US in particular, but also the EU whenever it suited us. And of course they will ask us, why aren't we doing more? Why have we allowed Israel to kill 35,000 innocent Palestinians? And this is something that we don't have a very good answer for. So what I'm arguing here is basically that the Latin American reaction to the Ukraine war is actually quite a good prism through which to observe some of the challenges that the China-US rivalry is posing, and also the weakness of our multilateral institutions in this increasingly multipolar world. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you so for this, Charles, for mentioning Latin America. Definitely, because the High Representative for Foreign Policy was Spanish, maybe that triggered a bit of interest. I'm not sure the next one will have this much interest for the continent. Now, we spoke about Islam, we spoke about, well, you mentioned triggered Islam, we spoke about Africa and Latin America, we spoke about double standards. Let me now turn to Marat, because Turkey is a very brilliant example of double agenda, or multiple agenda, playing in a various number of organizations, being part of NATO, but being part of its own organization, having its own perspective with the Turksoy, the former Turksoy, the Turkish Council Organization, being part of the Council of Europe, being part of OSCE, but maybe in Kazan in October, being part of BRICS, as I happen to know that your Prime Minister may very well have this ambition, maybe be more than an observer or a partner of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So I want to address this question: how does a country like Turkey, which is essential, pivotal on its geographical perspective when it comes to the war in Ukraine, manage to have this double agenda, being part of what we, or certain number of our colleagues call the triple axis, Iran, China, and Russia, but on the other hand, being still part of NATO, being part of Council of Europe, and still being part of the rule-based order?
Thank you. Tough question, but a lot answers.
You have 10 minutes.
Let me assure that. First of all, let me touch the term Global South, because usually it's misleading to understand if it exists or not. And if you go through the literature, you can see some explanations regarding the economic backwardness of the countries. Sometimes G77 plus is on the agenda. Sometimes you see maps, for instance, a line dividing the globe from north and south with blues and reds, etc. But what I believe is that it's usually the shared concerns and also impacts exposed, especially from the events that they are not in charge of controlling it. That's the parameter. That's why the countries that call themselves as part of Global South, well, you can visit Gramsci, you can visit the other scholars, etc., world, system theory, etc. Conceptual explanations are usually behind the events. That's a fact. But when you observe their patterns, well, they have shared concerns. And these concerns are not stable, but changing in every year, month, even the decade. So when you take one country delving exactly what's going on in a certain geography like Russian and Ukraine war, they have their own criteria, maybe assessing exactly what sort of impact I will enjoy right after this event. That's one of the issue. The second issue, the newly emerging threats, risks, concerns are a bit different. Radicalization, extremism, and I see both of them, by the way, the same, exactly the same. Radicalism is not about the religion, especially of Islam, but extremism is the same, radicalization, I believe. Well, immigrations, education, starvation, and these new headlines make these countries to coordinate and act together. That's a fact. On the other hand, they are dependent. This is another issue. In this sense, if you ask me if the Global South exists as the first question at the very beginning of your introduction, well, it doesn't. On the other hand, it exists. Per the event they exposed, they usually communicate under the umbrellas of the international organizations, and they usually complain it. For instance, now let me touch to Turkey. It will be much more easier to depict the situation. President Erdogan's saying the globe is more than 5. It's a clear challenge to current international order. That's a fact. It requires, it demands, it requests, whatever you say, per the degree of the sentence, a change in decision-making system and the norms to be built up by the international community. Why? Because there's a general belief in the minds that injustice is over there. Especially the double standards that you have mentioned, sir. Well, it's the cause of such a demand. On the other hand, per the question you have directed to me in this panel session, I think the geography is the fate. That's a fact. Turkey, if you check the maps, is in the global south, depicted clearly. On the other hand, Turkey is a member of NATO, a candidate to the European Union, have good relations with Russia and China, and it's normal. Why? Because of, first of all, historical legacy. Second, prerequisites of the events. Third, the attitude of the dealt actors currently, especially in the West. And fourth, interests, economic situation, and also societal facts. There is one thing maybe should be delineated in here for Global South. It's the societal dimension of each country, which is totally different from each other and mostly mixed up because of the former interventions under the colonial terms or later than that. So, in a geography that Turkey is currently positioning, well, it's not that much easier to manage the problems as we have discussed before the panel. How? If we are in Balkans right now, well, you have to know the culture, differences, interests, concerns, and impacts of the regional events on each country so you can position yourself. On the other hand, Turkey is facing another series of events at the east. For instance, Caucasus, Iran, and also at the south. On the other hand, Turkey must surpass a limit. This is the belief in the minds of decision makers. It's what? Now, Turkey is more than a regional power because of the regional system surrounding. On the other hand, not capable of being a superpower or global power. You can go and visit military, economy, politics, etc. That's the fact of Turkey. That's why Turkey started a first belt and second belt engagement in the close neighborhood. And that's why Turkey pursues a direct engagement to the adjacent countries in the region. On the other hand, dealing with all individually. But should be in Africa, for instance, not for the sake of promoting ideas, but to pursue a win-win strategy because Turkey needs it. Turkey needs to enhance economy and interaction. Why? You can visit Wallerstein. Turkey does not want to be a peripheral state. Turkey is currently a semi-peripheral state and wants to promote, that's a fact, wants to be an actor directly engaging with these countries or regions. And that's for sure, once Turkey starts such an engagement, there will be a resistance from the core states. It's pure, understandable because they will not, in a position to share the wealth or the power. So, for Turkey, specifically answering your question, I believe, if Turkey wants to say, okay, that's enough, I will stay within my limits and that's enough, I think France will be happier because of the competition in Africa. That's a fact. On the other hand, once you entrap yourself behind the borders, then you are a subject to the events developing in the close neighborhood and sometimes at the global level. Why? There's a difference of Turkey. If something happens in the very close vicinity of Turkish borders, all global hands are over there. Russia, China, the United States, and EU as well. So that's why Turkey is destined to observe and in case required, act or react. I call it as active defense per the literature, but sometimes Turkey has to intervene in an aggressive manner if the problem is existential threat. So that's why, Turkish engagement to global south is within the limits, though Turkey wants to expand it. That's a fact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Murat, for this presentation. Listening to you, I was saying that we have made a huge step from what Mehmet Davutoglu called the no problems with 100% of our neighbors, which I think was a very long time ago, 1991, I do remember, but very interesting for us to understand the ambiguity, strategic ambiguity. I'm French, so I can endorse that, playing with the way our French president mentioned it. We should have had an eminent colleague of ours, and I will give the floor to the audience, Kishore Mahbubani from the National University of Singapore, former dean of Lee Kuan Yew University, who reminds us maybe of a sort of summary of what we all said, is that the leadership of the North during the last 4 centuries depended on the South. And that is no longer nor legitimate, nor rational, and of course it's triggering in the other direction. I would, of course, have liked Kishore to mention this, as you all have read his book. He's advocating for this on a very important perspective. We haven't had an Asiatic or Asiatism point of view, but of course that that will be for next year. So now we have 10 minutes, I think 8 minutes 31, but we have 10 minutes to return to the floor for questions, comments, and of course I will ask a last round of presentation or last round of comments from the panel. Are there other questions? Please feel free. No one? No, not lunchtime. We have 10 minutes, so we're not going to miss next time. No question? Yeah, please, sir. Can you present yourself and say to whom you want to address the questions?
Igor Burakovsky, Kyiv, Ukraine, think tank, Institute for Economic Recession Policy Consultant. Well, my question is much more maybe well academic, and that's why I'm not sure whom should I address it, but I have the following question. If you take the current circumstances, our allies, they're imposing a number of sanctions against Russia in order to help Ukraine, to reduce its economic ability, to wage the war. Judging from your experience and your knowledge of the global south, whatever it may mean actually, can we expect that, this sanction group will be joined by countries from global south, or they would abstain from, this type of support of combating aggression from Russia?
Thank you. Who wants to address this question? Chris?
I'm sure all of us have something to say, so I'll put it with mine. Yeah, very quickly. In fact, if you don't mind, I will say something about an anecdote from Ecuador. Okay, so it was there about 6 months ago. We were taken after the conference down to a valley below Quito, where flower farms are and the like. Talking with the people, they said, we're very, very unhappy. Our principal market for our flowers is Russia. Actually, roses to Russia, May Day and all of that. And we now no longer are able to pursue this because we're in collateral damage in the sanctions war. So their position, and I think is representative of many voices I've heard, is to say that, they're not going to support this sort of thing because it's economically damaging. They read it through their own interests exactly as I've suggested. So that's quickly my point.
Very quickly. Yes, that's absolutely right. Small little anecdote about Ecuador. Chris, you prompted that one. The US, the Pentagon, asked the Ecuadorians to hand over all of the Soviet-era weapons that they have, MiGs and so on, and the Americans promised to exchange that with new US-made weapons. The Ecuadorians began to think about doing this. The Russians then said, if you do that, we will stop importing Ecuadorian bananas. The Ecuadorians backpedaled, end of story. They still have these wonderful 50-year-old MiGs, which they probably don't fly. But more importantly, the Latin American position is very simple. Unless sanctions are the product of United Nations General Assembly decisions, they will not abide by them. And they are not. Whether we like it or not, they are not, right? These are not UN, this is not a UN General Assembly decision. If it's a UN General Assembly decision, in keeping with international law, they will apply sanctions. If not, they regard sanctions essentially as an expression of Western, US and European dominated interests. So my answer, like Chris's, is no.
Natalia.
Yes, I think that I would like to also say that looking at it from a security perspective, especially in Africa, if we see, for example, Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali have actually withdrawn their partnership from ECOWAS. So this was a bold statement to also say that they can be more independent in security terms, and they can also use Russian support on actually doing that. So there is a question of how the US and the EU will reply to that. Thank you.
Murat.
I agree. You know, the global south is, well, in search of prosperity and some guarantees. As far as Russia, China, or any challenging actor to the interests of the West provide incentives with affordable prices and privileges, political privileges, well, they will be in favor of it, because it's very clear that they are destined to provide opportunities for their local publics in the forms of services. Otherwise, you may face colorful revolutions or Arab Springs, maybe in Africa in the coming term, especially if the borders are that much complicated in terms of sovereignties. In this sense, I don't think that sanctions does not have the same effect on the countries applied. Iran, Russia, or else, doesn't matter. If the country is totally dependent on the country or region imposing sanction, well, it may have an impact, but for a country like Russia, I don't think so.
So are there other questions? One last question. We do have time.
Since nobody's asking, so all right.
I'll give you the floor afterwards, don't worry.
Yeah, so thank you. It was a wonderful discussion. Really loved it. My name is Anil. I'm a professor here at XIVb Bucharest. But coming from Global South, obviously, sort of a duty to make a comment or something like that. Along those lines that Chris was discussing, just I wanted to get your view or the panel's assessment about this. Where do we stand on this? Because we're shying away of labeling this as a Cold War 2.0, right? But I was going through a recent report by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, as a very interesting pattern is coming out. The globalization in terms of numbers has not come down, but in terms of, trade within blocks are coming down, but trade with separate blocks are going up. So the IMF has labeled it kind of a fragmented globalization and things like that. So in this context, all the panelists, anybody would like to answer, where you see this going, right? Are we kind of like sliding into the Cold War 2.0, or this is telling us something different? I hope I'm clear. If not, I can elaborate furthermore.
Very clear. So there will be clear answers. Who wants to address this? Chris? Charles, sorry.
Totally agree. We're not deglobalizing, we're fragmenting globalization. And the EU is trading with, we're nearshoring, we are friendshoring, and so on. And that's a very different scenario to the Cold War. I mean, what's actually most interesting, I think, about the current situation is that the Soviet Union really wasn't such a formidable rival. You know, if it hadn't been for nuclear weapons, it would have been a relatively manageable rival. China, of course, has the technology, it has the population, it has the military wherewithal, and so you know it's a much more holistic 360-degree challenge to the international status quo. But I don't think what we will see, I think, for the time being, is a consolidation of fragmentation, a weakening of multilateral institutions, particularly trade institutions. But we also have to ask ourselves, who is actually doing this? You know, the US has become the worst enemy of the WTO, of the World Trade Organization. Probably no other country in the world right now is doing more to weaken the WTO than the United States of America. It's not China. So, you know, we have to reconsider what we're going to do with these multilateral institutions. We need a new set of multilateral institutions to replace the Bretton Woods institutions, but right now there's no consensus on that. So my fear, my prediction is increased fragmentation and increased rivalry between G20, G7, and other regional formations. Thank you.
Romanian point of view.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, the panel. I would like to address a very direct questions. Do you consider that would be possible to create some international synergy between for the efforts in order to counter Russian policy in Africa? I'm referring here current Russian policies in Africa. I'm referring here the presence of Wagner Group in the last years in various African countries, and the brutal change of regimes in those countries, definitely supported by Russia. Maybe, yeah, it's a need for an international reaction to this. Maybe we can discuss a bit on it. Thank you.
I have my French point of view, but I will not give it. And I will leave the floor to my colleague from Greece.
Yes, so I think it's clear to say that Russia is presenting itself in Africa as the natural leader of anti-colonialism. And to do that, its aspiration is to become the regional hegemony at in the region. And so in a multipolar world, you do that by multiplying risks. And I think what Russia is doing right now in Africa is exactly the example of that, right? So the international reaction to that, well, it's up to the US and its allies in the EU to how they will deal with that challenge. I think for the moment, it is a challenge. And I don't know if the EU is actually united in that sense and in that topic. Thank you.
Thank you. We're already out of time, but I do not want to waste the wonderful panel that we have, and we'll give 1 minute each for an additional question. Because, as you all have in mind, there is a mindset in Europe to engage institutionally driven with Global South. President Emmanuel Macron asked to be an observer of the BRICS. And in the Johannesburg last summit, the president of South Africa said no. So how do we engage, or how do you feel we should engage from a European perspective, from a Western perspective, with the Global South? Should we engage in new organizations? Should we be part of the merging organization? Or should we find an agenda in order to find a global, let's say, mid-range perspective on this issue?
Well, I think there are some parameters should be claimed, and very fast. First of all, there must be consistency, because
1 minute each, huh?
Yes. There must be consistency, because once you demand something what not share, it's not fair. The second issue, decision-making procedures and system in the global order is really much centralized among the G7 countries. That's a fact. So if you don't share it, there will be problems. Not only at the state level, by the way, but communal levels. And third, economy does have a really important input. Once people are starving in Africa, well, expect more immigrants, more challenges to the states that they are citizens of, and not the states, but regimes will be concerned about their futures and its suppression. That means if you want to engage to the global south, I think there must be first a policy regarding the expectations of the communities, because these communities are divided in these countries. That's another issue.
Thank you. Chris?
Thanks. I think that there's already a process, regional organizations which have a kind of +1 factor, ASEAN +1, CELAC +1. And so these I think are, to join in those processes, partly what the European Union has been doing, but it can do more of it, more actively seek that position up. So that's at a kind of regional, both economic and or security level, diplomatic security. The second I would say is that, and in a way I thank my colleagues for commentaries because it helped me think about this. There's an illiberal global south and there's a liberal global south. And these elements, are the ones, the natural partners and those who are kind of pushing against the edge. And I think that that's a partnership that needs to be cultivated. I'm not sure the vehicle, but I think it needs to be recognized and cultivated.
Natalia, and then Charles.
Yes, very quickly. I think I mostly outlined my answer to this, but I think we have to wait for the European election and see the outcome of that elections and how the EU will become an actor in Africa, and if it will be through France or if it will be through another state that could lead the response. Thank you.
Two things very quickly. First of all, at the EU level, I think if we are ambitious, we need to lead the charge which will lead to a new multilateral order. What do Europeans do best? We sit and form committees and establish rules and regulations. The EU is a community of law. So I think we should take the initiative, acknowledge that most of our multilateral institutions are broken, and take the initiative in reforming them. Secondly, general principle, preach less, listen more.
Thank you for this summary, in a way, Charles. Thank you so much for the audience. I think you can join me in a very big round of applause for our 4 wonderful panelists. As I mentioned, I'm a prospectivist, and there's a lot to be said. We haven't tackled one question. Maybe that will be a subject for the next round of discussions. What will be the impact of the American elections when it comes to engaging with the Global South? We do know that President Donald Trump has a certain number of friends, which may not be totally the same that we have in Europe. So I'm leaving that for a perspective for next year, and I hope we see you, each and every one of you, next year or in this perspective. So maybe a rapid photo, group of, I don't know if it's scheduled. Well, okay. I know that you have to leave, Charles. So thank you so much.